So, hi, Professor. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the event today. So, I want to give a little bit self-introduction. My name is Lingxi Li. I'm the managing director of the Princeton University Press China office. So, thanks all the online and offline audience for joining our June Princeton-Yale Idea Series. This is a new initiative in this year, featuring world-leading scholars and their most recent publications aiming to foster scholarly exchange between China and the West on most cutting-edge topics of global relevance. So I just want to give a very brief introduction of the press in China. Princeton University Press is the only and so far the first and so far the only American university press opening an office in China dedicated to the two-way exchange, publishing the very best scholars in China, bringing their perspective to the attention of a global audience and bringing the English language works into China and foster global learnings. So today we're very pleased to have three honorable guests to feature our recent book, The Last Human Job, to our readers in China. So the author will join us online. And the moderator of today is Professor Tian Geng, who is associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Peking University. He received his bachelor degree in Peking University and PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, with primary research interest in political sociology, historical sociology, and social theory. So a little bit of the house rule today is Professor Tian will briefly introduce the books and the two speakers. And the speaker will speak for 40 minutes to offer the key insights of the book. And Professor Xiang Biao will share his perspective for another 15 minutes. Then there will be a discussion and a Q&A sessions. And I want to give my ongoing appreciation to Yale Center Beijing and welcome Carol to introduce a little bit of the center and the history. Yeah, Carol.
Good evening to our audiences here, and good morning to Allison, and good afternoon to Professor Xiang. Welcome to this Princeton University Press and Yale Center Beijing event. My name is Carol Rafferty. I'm a Yale College graduate, as well as the executive director for Yale Center Beijing. This year, we're celebrating our 10th anniversary in Beijing, and I'm just so delighted that we've had this longstanding partnership with Princeton University Press, where we feature the best authors from around the world and scholars as well, to be discussing the most interesting and cutting edge issues facing our world. Many of you may already follow our WeChat accounts or Chinese social media accounts. Around every 2 to 3 days, we have an event like these featuring thought leaders from all sectors. So hopefully I'll get to see many of you. And I also want to welcome the scholars on today's panel or discussion today, Professor Allison Pugh from the University of Virginia. I should have brought a copy with me. I bought a copy of the book today at the event, which is at a discounted price, and I hope many of you will as well. Also welcome to Professor Xiang Biao from Oxford University and Professor Tian Geng from Peking University. I hope I'll be able to welcome many of you in person in the very near future. And without further ado, let's welcome Professor Tian Geng. Thank you very much.
Good evening, the audience and the Yale Center. Thank you so much to the Yale Center in Beijing and Princeton University Press for coordinating such an exciting event that brings us the very exciting book by Professor Pugh. So in the beginning, let me just introduce our author and the main discussant so that we can begin hearing about Professor Pugh's introduction of his wonderful book. Professor Pugh's book, this is the fourth monograph, I think the first coming out from Princeton University Press, The Lost Human Job. So in the first of three books, Professor Pugh did a wonderful sociologist works on sociology of culture, emotional labor, and also he has acute analysis of how caring job can deliver humane values and goals. So in this book, we will see a fascinating combination of a long research tradition that emphasizes the emotional understanding of interpersonal interaction, and also a very innovative framework that put the ongoing AI mass movement into our most intimate social relationship. I believe Professor Pugh had many wonderful findings and also his unique fieldwork experience to share with us. Now, Professor Pugh is a professor in University of Virginia, and she's the vice president elect of the American Sociological Association. Our main discussant for tonight, Professor Xiang Biao, is also widely known to the Chinese audience, also the international scholarly community for his innovative works on sociological ethnographies. Uh, so Professor Xiang published his first book. It's called The Community That Crosses Boundaries, based on his fieldwork in Beijing in his BA and MA years. And then he published his award-winning book also from Princeton University Press, The Global Body Shop. For the last few years, as many of the audience may know, that Professor Xiang is very focusing on revealing the emotional texture of people's knowledge about their proximity, of their parochial communities, because he emphasized on how to get our human emotion back to the highly mobile, highly technologized life in the current society. So I believe Professor Xiang is a perfect discussant for Professor Pugh's book, because both had wonderful field work and also have written out books about how we should know ourselves, how in what circumstances we claim that we know each other by a unique emotional standing. So let's welcome our author and discussant, Professor Pugh, please.
Okay, so thank you so much for this invitation. I really appreciate it. I'm particularly grateful to the Yale Center Beijing and also to my discussants and those who have been introducing me and buying the book today. That's so kind. I'm very appreciative. Let's see. So I'm going to jump right in and say that as we assess the risks of AI, we are overlooking a crucial threat. Critics commonly highlight three primary hazards. That's job disruption, loss, bias, and surveillance or privacy. We hear that AI will cause many people to lose their jobs, from dermatologists to truck drivers to marketers. We hear how AI turns historical correlations into predictions that enforce inequality, so that in the United States, sentencing algorithms predict more recidivism for Black men than white ones. We hear that apps help authorities watch people, such as Amazon tracking which drivers look away from the road. What we are not talking about, however, is just as vital. What happens to human relationship when one side is mechanized? The conventional story of AI's dangers is blinding us to its role in a cresting depersonalization crisis. If we are concerned about increasing loneliness and social fragmentation, then we should pay closer attention to the kind of human connections that we enable or impede. And those connections are being transformed by an influx of technology. I spent 5 years observing and talking to more than 100 people employed in human interpersonal work, which I came to call connective labor. I also talked to the engineers who are automating and the administrators who are overseeing this work. And I found that the injection of technology into relationships renders connective labor invisible, makes workers have to prove that they are not robots, and encourages firms to overload workers, compressing their labor into ever smaller increments of time and space. And most important, no matter how good the AI is, there is no human relationship when one half of the encounter is a machine. What you're looking at actually are pictures of my work that was involved in the talking and observing of the practitioners who did this work. My focus on this work is, my focus in this research is on work that requires relationship. So that means therapists, teachers, coaches, sex workers, even business managers and high-end sales staff. Many depend on their ability to connect to others to make their contribution. Clients healing, students learning, employees motivated, customers satisfied. If we pay attention to what these different jobs require from their workers, we see a lot of commonalities. They all seem to require some form of empathic listening, in which one cultivates a sense of or a vision of the other person, and witnessing, in which that vision is reflected back to the other. Another crucial ingredient is the ability to regulate one's own emotions, to get out of the way of hearing and understanding the other. Most important, this process is deeply interactive, not least because for it to land successfully, the other must assent to some degree with the vision that is being reflected their way. I call this work connective labor, to capture this mutual achievement, and I define it as the forging of an emotional understanding of another person to create valuable outcomes. This work is essentially invisible. It's only partially understood and not usually recognized, reimbursed, or rewarded. Despite its ubiquity and importance, it has long been associated with femininity, presumed to be part of women's nature, and more explicitly linked to jobs that women tend to hold, like teaching or nursing, while ignored or downplayed when found in jobs where men predominate, like management or the law. And it has powerful impact. For example, Ben Juster, who was a teacher I spoke to and also a private school administrator, told me, "I think each kid needs to be seen, like really seen. I don't think a kid really gets it on a deep level. I don't think they are really bitten by the information or the content until they feel seen by the person they're learning from." Another person I spoke to, Simon Jarrett, was a primary care physician, and he said, "If I ask the right questions, I can ask about anxiety, stress, and sometimes they break down in tears, and I'm like, okay, this is really what's going on." Other research documents these impacts that my informants told me about all the time. So, for example, doctor-patient relationships, we know, are more effective than a daily aspirin to ward off heart attacks. So Ben and Simon are two of millions whose work relies on relationship, from teachers to therapists to managers to hairdressers. By some accounts, the US is moving from a thinking economy to a feeling economy as many deploy their emotional antenna to bear witness and reflect back what they understand so that clients, patients, and students feel seen. And for many, connective labor is profoundly meaningful. Pamela Moore was an African-American teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she told me how her own middle school teacher took the time to find out that her selective mutism, she didn't talk very much when she was in middle school, was a response actually to her family moving incessantly. She told me, I thought, I want to be that teacher for my kids in this city. I want to be the teacher that I wanted and that I needed and that I finally got. I have an entire chapter in this book, just parenthetically, in which I document these sorts of two-way effects, in which people talk about how they generate motivation in the other, but find purpose for themselves. They find their work, or they do their work to create dignity in the other, but they find their own humanity. They do their work to help the other gain understanding, and they end up finding understanding about themselves. However, this work is nonetheless threatened by automation and by AI. Even therapy, one of the professions most dependent on emotional connection between people, has seen inroads from automated bots, from the Wobot to Marco. As Michael Barbaro, who is a New York Times journalist who hosts a daily podcast called The Daily, when he listens, at one point he had an episode where he talked about ChatGPT-3, and he asked it a question about, like, why am I so critical? And when the bot gave an answer, he announced on air, "Ooh, I'm feeling seen, really seen." Another example, someone I spoke to, Tim Bickmore, was a Northeastern researcher, and he has developed an AI couples counselor, an exercise coach, and even a palliative care consultant. The picture you're seeing is something he created called a virtual nurse, which was an AI program to help low-income patients at Boston Medical Center with discharge procedures. And he hoped that it would enable them to understand what are sometimes long and complicated instructions. So the virtual nurse, whom coders dubbed Louise or Elizabeth, she's no more than an animated figure on the screen, and there's a mechanized voice that asks the viewers if they are fans of the baseball team, the Red Sox, before going over the after-hospital care plan. So Bickmore reported that 74% of his low-income patients preferred a discharge AI agent that he named Louise to a human nurse. Why? Because the program let them go slower than would a busy clinician. One patient told Bickmore, "I prefer Louise. She's better than a doctor. She explains more, and doctors are always in a hurry." Providers spend an average of 7 minutes with patients at discharge, and studies have shown that low literacy patients need more like an hour. So the appeal of this kind of judgment-free tech is strong, particularly for disadvantaged people. But what I want us to ask is, how did we get here? There is something deeply paradoxical about machines being able to handle the non-mechanistic time needs of the elderly or children or low literacy patients, the unemployed, while humans are rushing about, bent to the master of the industrial clock. How did we get to the point where computers are what have time for us, while other human beings do not? The answer lies in the degradation of connective labor, a degradation that began with perhaps good intentions about improving performance and availability, and that has nonetheless reached its nadir through pervasive tracking, efficiency campaigns, and data analytics. For example, Erin Nash was a hospital chaplain whose job was to be with people in some of their worst moments, praying, holding hands, even singing with them. And I shadowed her on her rounds, and I watched as she managed to create kind of brief, peaceful moments with suffering patients and their families, again and again. making temporary sanctuary between the thin blue medical curtains, despite the buzzing alarms and fluorescent lighting and constant stream of footsteps on the linoleum floors nearby. But in addition to consoling the bereaved and calming the anxious, I was surprised to learn that Erin also had to fill out 3 separate charts for every person she visited, including the standard electronic health record system that many clinicians in the United States use. She even carried around a cheat sheet to help her remember the codes. She murmured under her breath, asking for prayer as a resource, family together as a resource, while she's like hunting and pecking on the keyboard. Nobody was billed for Erin's work, so why was she charting in triplicate? Connective labor like Erin's is increasingly being subjected to new systems that try to make it more efficient, measurable, and reproducible. At best, firms implement these systems assuming that such interventions will not get in the way of workers and clients connecting. At worst, they ignore or dismiss those connections altogether. Even these complex interpersonal jobs are facing efforts to gather information and assessment data and to introduce technology. Moneyball is the title of a best-selling book in the United States that chronicled how data analytics transformed the national pastime of professional baseball. And as I found, Moneyball has come for connective labor. Teachers have long complained about standardized testing and surveillance, but it is not just teachers anymore. I listened to scores of workers in many fields talk about the spread of counting and scripting, like Valerie Clausen, a hairdresser in Virginia. She said, they set a timer and they tell you, okay, you can only talk for this long, and if your service time is slowing down, then stop the talking and get to doing what you need to do. You know, sometimes you need to stop and make real live contact with somebody, not just through the mirror, if you're into that deep of a conversation, and they really don't want that to happen. Everything put together is 22 minutes. That's all you got. It doesn't matter what, 22 minutes. We can certainly have sympathy for the goals underlying these changes. Research finds that systems like checklists and manuals can confer greater legitimacy upon many kinds of service work and hedge our bets against incompetence and discrimination, while also protecting workers from demanding or chaotic clients. Standards often come with transparency and predictability, and they allow for greater coordination and mobility and efficiency. And in part, these changes aim for a society where getting a good teacher or doctor or hairdresser is less dependent on being lucky or affluent. Yet research also shows that scripting of interactive service work threatens creativity and autonomy, transforms clients into standardized industrial objects, and demoralizes workers, alienating them from their own feeling. More than 50% of physicians say they are burnt out by data entry. In a Gallup survey, about half of teachers and nurses reported experiencing high levels of job-related stress. Changes in the way that we organize connective labor are extracting enormous costs. If there is a battle over the systematization of feeling work, we may have already conceded it when it comes to teachers and low-wage service workers like Valerie. But scripting and counting is invading other relational professional work, even therapy, perhaps the last redoubt of sentiment. Insurance companies decide what kind of therapy warrants reimbursement. They dictate the content focus of particular sessions, and they limit the number of sessions for a given disorder. Some counseling centers are requiring therapists to administer surveys, offering clients graphs of particular clinicians' impact. When Sarah Merced, a therapist at a veterans hospital, talked about the mandated treatment plans that were decreed from above, I was struck by her wistfulness. She said, "I guess my wish as a clinician would be to be able to use some actual clinical thinking," she said. "I went to school for many years to kind of figure out what best treatments work for most people. And so it would be lovely to be able to choose when to use these tools and when not, versus having them mandated." The industrial model has become so dominant, even in these spaces where deep feeling has profound impact, that it is something of a cultural juggernaut, shaping how people think and talk about value. In my research, I watched as even connective labor practitioners found themselves trapped within its interpretive framework, forced to articulate their contributions and their constraints, however reluctantly, with its alien grammar. This sort of influence was evident when I talked to Alan Krupner, who was actually the supervisor of the chaplain I talked about earlier, Erin Nash. The most important reason for all the charting that Erin Nash did, he said, was that someday the hospital was going to decide the future of the chaplain service, and that data supporting what they did would help chaplains steer that future. He said, "I felt like chaplains needed to learn how to count something because we live in a world increasingly driven by evidence. The question is, are we going to be the ones who say these things, or is someone else going to tell us that we drive the bus so you're going to do what we tell you to do?" The chaplains may someday be able to convince healthcare administrators that their work was important. But to do that, he said, we need to get over ourselves. Alan's argument is one thing. It's a statement about the inevitability of quantitative data deciding the place of a spiritual team in the hospital. It attests to medicine's institutional muscle, as well as the intellectual hegemony of evidence-based thinking in his world. But his language, chaplains need to learn how to count something, and we need to get over ourselves, with its kind of casual mockery of chaplains as number-averse feelers, is another evidence of a certain cultural supremacy of standardization. But standardization and the drive to increase productivity among these workers is worsening their performance. One doctor told me, "I don't invite people to open up because I don't have time." And that is such a disservice to the patients. My hand is on the doorknob, I'm typing, I'm like, let's get you the meds and get you out the door because I have a ton of other patients to see this morning. You know, everyone deserves as much time as they need, and that's what would really help people, is to have that time, but it's not profitable. Technologists argue that social emotional AI addresses problems of human performance, human access and availability, which is a bit like the old joke about the guests at a resort complaining about the food being terrible and in such small portions. It is certainly true that human connective labor is fraught, full of judgment and risk of misrecognition. And I heard that from many people, including, for example, Pamela, the teacher who repeatedly faced kind of, we might say it, bad connective labor until she met the middle school teacher who finally listened to her. But the working conditions of connective labor shape people's capacity to see the other. Veronica Agostini is a person I spoke to who demonstrates for us some of the costs of social emotional AI. She was a young white woman in San Francisco, and she was hired as an online coach for a therapy app startup to help people connect with the app. She may not have been doing therapy, but as Veronica described her work, it sounded more and more familiar. She said, basically what happened is you talk to someone one time, and then, if they were interested and you did a good job on that first call, you would talk to them every week for sometimes like 12 weeks. I talked to some people for like months. Some aspects of the job made it clear that it was not therapy. When clients mastered their problem, often they would just drop the app, behavior more akin to closing a self-help book than it was to the sometimes lengthy experience of ceasing a therapy relationship. Furthermore, Veronica said, there were rules in place to keep the coaches from acting as mental health professionals. So you were allowed to reflect what was in the program, she told me, but you could never give advice. You obviously could never make a diagnosis. And you couldn't, tell them what to do or anything like that. But the rules dividing their work from therapy seemed more for the coaches than for the clients, some of whom were happy to think of the coaches as private counselors. She said, you genuinely had an impact on people and you talked to them every day and you saw how things were for them. I loved talking to all these people, she told me. I loved feeling like I had an impact. She also suffered from burnout. It was so hard to set boundaries, she told me. I would think about the clients after I went home, and there was no training on how to deal with that. Yet, despite both the profound meaning of her work and the emotional wallop that it delivered to the coaches, her own language actually joins in minimizing her effect. She said, I loved feeling like I had an impact, but she quickly followed that with, even though it was really them that was doing, they were doing all the work, I wasn't really doing anything. I was just cheering them on and helping them work through some hard things sometimes. Thus, the firm maintained that Veronica was not doing therapy and benefited from that claim by not having to train, hire, or pay for skilled workers, while extracting the value that their witnessing helped create. The clients came and went as if they were not doing therapy, treating Veronica as if she were an extension of the app. And even Veronica asserted that she was not doing therapy. Their collective insistence rendered invisible the work she actually did to witness the client's needs and struggles, and the price she paid for it in the emotional residue that their trauma left behind. And this invisibilization is something that AI does in other fields as well. We know, for example, the armies of people who identify, data for machine learning. This is a bagel and that is a dog. That's something that other researchers have documented again and again. But here we see it's happening also in connective labor. Veronica also faced a new existential task, proving that she was a human being. A lot of people were like, "Are you a robot?" she told me. I asked her how she countered that impression. I basically just tried to small talk with them, ask another question, maybe share a little bit about myself as if it was appropriate. Other people told me about this problem, and they distinguished themselves from machines through their capacity to decode hidden parts of humans. So even if AI might elicit more secrets from people, it would not be able to understand or manage the secrets it was told, one therapist, Grace, told me. She says, as an example, she told me about a client who lied frequently. And she said, and so, we have a societal judgment around lying, but once I established, well, this is a weird pattern that I don't usually see, then I went into what's useful about it to this person. And the answer was that lying was the way her client made sure, quote, he has his own mind. She said, he merges with everyone. And so when he lies, it's when he's feeling like there's no him, Grace said. And then she paused. See a computer do that. She positioned herself against a computer by demonstrating her empathic insight into this mysterious and shame-ridden pattern. And a third way that I found that people apparently demonstrated their humanness was through human error. And this was particularly evident for connective labor practitioners working in, highly systematized environments where mistakes were like flickers of authenticity. Veteran hospital therapists gave many examples of how mistakes they had made actually led to more progress and rapport with their clients when they rectified them. Mistakes seemed to convey to clients or students that they were getting a second look, that they were worth seeing correctly, and that what was doing the seeing was a human being and not a robot. In essence, these people's connective labor, normally the quintessential human activity, was not enough to convey their humanness, which Veronica had to verify for a clientele accustomed to machines. Finally, Veronica may have found the work humbling and moving and powerful, but she left after 4 years because the firm, ignoring the emotional content of the coaching job, increased the client roster to untenable levels. She said, toward the end, they were trying to model everything using algorithms and models, and it's just like you can't account for the actual emotional burden of the job in those moments. Already convinced the coaches were nothing but handmaidens to the app, the firm piled on new clients heedlessly. Veronica shows us one version of AI in this terrain, in which humans work behind the scenes to create the promise of a mechanized connective labor without human judgment. But there is another version that is out there, in which AI and humans don't overlap or hide behind each other so much, but they're put to different uses. And some technologists argue that feeling and thinking are distinct and separable, and if computers are for thinking, humans are for feeling. If robots take on medical diagnostics, for example, physicians could become more about being present with the patient, one administrator told me. Medical practitioners talk about wanting to help people rather than being robots, she said, concentrating on the emotional tie with the patient. The interpersonal stuff that no machine will do, she said, could be their chance. This argument epitomizes how AI is most often sold as a way of freeing up humans for more meaningful work. The consulting firm McKinsey, for example, has argued that it is far more likely that AI will change jobs rather than eradicate them, as well as create new ones that we cannot predict. And the firm noted that AI might free up workers for tasks that they called core to the human experience, like creativity or sensing emotions. I visited an experimental school in the San Francisco Bay Area, which sought to put this into practice, with kids using computer programs for customized lessons in reading and math and more, and the adults there for the relationship. Students had spreadsheets that organized their day, which was broken up into independent study or gold time, and chunks devoted to different specialized apps like Quill for grammar or Tinker, a coding program. And they also pursued what they called passion projects of their own design. The kids may have spent the morning learning from apps, but they were not entirely on their own. Advisors sat in a central area with their computers open and met with the kids one-on-one once a week for 45 minutes, keeping track of their progress. They were in charge of the relationship, although those sessions sometimes looked like a lot of data crunching, with advisor and student hunched over computers, keeping track of their progress. In a session typical of the ones I observed, an advisor, Vivian, typed into her computer as Jackson, a very quiet Chinese-American boy of about 13, sat next to her looking at his. And in their meeting, they spent a lot of time talking about deliverables, which is kind of business school speak for a measurable outcome. But in this case, a way to signify and record Jackson's progress. So for example, Vivian says, "You did 6 hours of IXL time. Let's put that in there. Is there a deliverable for language?" And Jackson says, "Just go to class, reading comprehension, and write essays." "Write essays," Vivian says. "How many?" Jackson says, 3. Vivian, 3 essays. That's a deliverable. Did you put in your Labster score? What was that in? Animal genetics. I got a 79. Let's stick that in. At the same time, these sessions could involve long periods of seeing and being seen. So one day, for example, I watched as an 8-year-old Asian American girl named Kim met with her advisor, Shelley, a white woman, and they gazed together at a computer screen that displayed an Excel sheet summarizing Kim's latest goals and accomplishments. And with the girl sitting next to her, Shelley asked, "So in programming, what do you want to do this term?" "Honestly, I'm not sure," Kim replied. She thoughtfully played with this long black ponytail. "Well, is there anything you're interested in?" Shelley asked. "You could combine it with your passion project. What's your passion project?" And Kim mentioned a business she was starting. We were in Silicon Valley, after all, and how it was based on an invention that she called a genius idea. And Shelley listened patiently, murmuring little sounds of assent and encouragement. There was all the time in the world for them to figure out a customized plan for programming. The teachers at this school cheered their new freedom to concentrate on offering one-on-one help to those who needed it. But while it seems clear that automation will generate jobs in industries that we cannot foresee, just like McKinsey and others are telling us, the AI will free us up language seems strikingly optimistic to me. It is possible that with the cost savings of automating work, employers could keep the same number of employees and instead imbue human jobs with newly meaningful tasks. But against a long history of cutting people wherever possible to save labor costs, this thinking seems quite naive. In a prime example of this, in Oakland, an hour away from the experimental school, low-income students of color were being taught math by videos. And in 2023, as we can see here, a Mississippi school district reported that students were learning geometry, Spanish, and high school science via a software program with a human teacher in the next town whom students could try to consult if they got stuck. The devaluation of care underlies its automation. Technologists take aim at these jobs because they don't respect the interpersonal work that they rely upon. They view the workers as replaceable or their clients as undeserving, and they consider their replacement by technology a more politically palatable solution than improving them through staffing ratios or pay. The freeing up argument actually underscores a long-standing bifurcation. For almost 2 centuries, the split between feeling and rationality, connectedness and autonomy, nature and technology has anchored gendered identities and inequalities, with feminist scholars all the way back to Simone de Beauvoir rejecting the inevitability of that forging and highlighting the social relations that create it. But now, technologists themselves are trying to shift that split onto the human connection itself, onto the human condition itself. And this is actually where my hope lies, if there is any in this story, because if feeling is for humans, then perhaps we can start to value it more. This was brought home to me a few years ago when I met a radiologist at a social gathering. For someone who follows debates about artificial intelligence, it felt a little bit like meeting a polar bear floating on an ice floe. Radiology is one of those professions that futurists and pundits say is likely to shed a lot of jobs because AI has already demonstrated impressive pattern recognition in reading X-rays for anomalies. And the doctor told me he was working at the national level to try to change the way radiologists do their work so that they would no longer simply discuss X-ray results with fellow physicians. The only way out of the path of the oncoming AI train, he said, was to make radiology more patient-facing, to bring radiologists into the examination room with the patient. Radiologists need to become what he called Sherpas for the images they read, helping interpret and explain results to patients directly. Otherwise, the radiologist told me, the field is in real danger. We're trying not to be the low-hanging fruit. Who talks to patients directly? Primary care physicians. Yet radiologists earn salaries almost twice and sometimes 3 times as much as primary care physicians on average. As I talked with the radiologist, it was suddenly clear to me that primary care might soon enjoy some real bargaining power over these subspecialties. And no less important, the radiologist's comments indicate that AI and automation have the potential to destabilize long-standing gendered bifurcation of feelings and technology, solidarity and rationality. If machines are that which are charged with the rational, the data-driven, the technical, what's left for humans is the emotional, the connected, the interpersonal, all that used to be identified as feminine before. It remains to be seen whether the new value put on interpersonal connectedness can upend the gender cues and job cues that have benefited radiologists before. AI could destabilize a central pillar in gender identity and inequalities through a feminization of the human. We are in the middle of a depersonalization crisis. And in the middle of this crisis, being seen is already in too short supply. The sense of being invisible is widespread, animating working class rage in the United States and abroad, and rife within the social crises of what has been called deaths of despair, suicide and overdose deaths that have lowered life expectancy here. While many of us, during COVID in particular, remain close to family and friends, there is one kind of relationship that has changed, the weak ties of civic life and commerce. Yet research shows that these ties help to knit together our communities and contribute to our health and well-being. A UK study found that people who talked to their baristas in Starbucks derived well-being benefits more than those who breezed right by them. And the authors titled their study, "Is Efficiency Overrated?" Human connections matter, even when they are not our closest bonds. The solution that big tech offers to our depersonalization crisis is what they call personalization, as in personalized education or personalized health. And these advances seek to counter the alienating invisibility of standardization, of being part of an undifferentiated mass. In these efforts, you are seen by machines. But what if it is important for us and for our social fabric, not just to be seen, but to be seen by other people? In that case, the working conditions of jobs like those of Simon, Jenna, Veronica, and others I've spoken about today are consequential. Connective labor is increasingly being subjected to new systems that try to make it more predictable, measurable, efficient, and reproducible. The degradation of these jobs, their reduction from a kind of artisanal, emotional craft work to a set of easily reproducible steps, actually acts as a slippery slope to their automation through AI and apps like Wobot, a therapy app, or Traitify, the personality test that McDonald's uses in hiring. But there is another path. In my book, I outline what I call a social architecture, and I document what organizations have in common that are doing it right, that support connective labor, rather than relying on individual heroes to do it anyway, despite unsustainable working conditions. Social architecture includes material resources like time and space, but also what I call a relational design, such as the leaders and mentors and peer groups, and also a connective culture, a shared set of beliefs and practices that affect how people are able to conduct relationship. And these factors combine to shape what it feels like to do connective labor, whether it is sustainable or a form of servitude. New policies to address client rosters and overload would also help, as would careful attention to data entry requirements and the imposition of new technologies that mediate relationships at work. I am not advocating eliminating all systems or standards, which some of my interviewees found useful, but we should pay close attention to the impact systems have on connective labor, the engine powering the outcomes we value, like learning and healing. One solution might be to protect feeling jobs from the data collection that threatens to overwhelm them, such as that plaguing primary care physicians or teachers. One medical assistant I spoke to acted as a scribe, and she treasured having more responsibility. But the real advantage was in the relationships she witnessed, she said. So that's one benefit, because the provider, this is her talking, because the provider's not looking into the computer and scrambling through different tabs. The provider takes all their time looking at the patient. I'm here, I'm talking to you, I'm listening to what you're saying. So not all technology, not all systems are bad. However, I want us to be careful here. We also need to regulate the AI industry so that innovators weigh their impact on human connections. At the very least, social emotional AI should be labeled as such so we know when we are talking to a robot and can recognize and choose human-to-human connection. Ultimately, however, we all need to be more aware of the unique value of human connection for our social health and the peril it faces. AI is often sold as a way of freeing up humans for other, often more meaningful work. Yet connective labor is among the most profoundly meaningful work that humans do, and technologists are nonetheless gunning for it. If we continue to prioritize efficiency over relationship, we degrade jobs that have the potential to forge profound meaning between people and along the way make them more susceptible to automation and AI, creating a new kind of haves and have-nots, those divided by access to other people's attention. While humans are imperfect and judgmental, to be sure, we also know that human attention and care are a source of purpose and dignity, the seeds of belongingness and bedrock of our communities. Yet we tuck that knowledge away in service to an industry that contributes to our growing depersonalization. What is at risk is more than an individual or his or her job, but our social cohesion, the connections that are a mutual achievement between and among humans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pugh, for the wonderful presentation and also the very insightful sharing of your not only the findings but your experience and as a human being during your field work. That itself it's a vivid case of how connective works. Why connective work is valuable for not only researcher, academy, but also for ordinary human being. Thank you so much for sharing that. Then for the next 15 to 20 minutes, we will have discussion from Professor Biao Xiang. Professor Xiang is director of a social anthropology of economic department, if I'm correct. Hi, Professor Xiang. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, so you have 15 to 20 minutes. Does that sound good?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Allison. I'm sorry I didn't show my video because I saw everyone else was not showing, so I thought probably it's a new rule of this room, and I assume there is audience in person in the hall, so probably I should not show my face, which could be distracting. And the book really helped me a lot thinking some questions that I have been concerned with. Okay, good. Now I see many people there. So I'm not fully qualified to provide any comments because I'm the anthropologist and not sociologist or economist. But I will probably just raise a couple of questions, almost as a lay reader, than to hear more from you, Alison. Number one is that I'm very touched by the message in your book that you said the connective labor is something very important but invisible, and by giving a name to it is already is a significant step. So I wonder, now it seems that you name that kind of human effort, attention, connective labor. So I wonder, how did you, I mean, this way of naming it, what is the effect the person whom you talked to? I mean, you mentioned I think in your preface or the introduction, people came to you after your lecture to say that's exactly what we do. There is a recognition, people gain the recognition that people desire, but it was not available to them. Now they see the name in that way. But I don't know whether you can elaborate a little more on this point, thinking that actual research is probably sometimes not only about documenting or revealing, but sometimes just giving a name to things that people know already. Yeah? So can you theorize a little more about this effect of that? And the number two question is, the way you name it is by calling it connective labor. And I have been thinking about that because a different story that we can tell about the phenomenon that you describe is to almost take an opposite direction, to say what the people are doing that is not labor. If you say it, and then the problem is we, we're naming it labor, and then we channel this type of humanity into a particular tunnel. And it becomes a subject of monitoring, regulation, and evaluation, and then to be susceptible to be replaced by AI and etc. But would it be possible we start with the notion that actually it is not labor and should not be reduced into labor, and the very fact that the type of humanity is being reduced to labor itself is a very telling part of the logic of capitalism. And then we have Hannah Arendt. This if we use her framework and labor, work, and action, I would say this is action. Is because it is intersubjective action. It should have been stayed outside of the domain of labor. But even if we adopt the Marxian tradition, then I still see some problem in the theoretical framework, how we can conceptualize it as a labor analytically. But I do recognize now that in the market, it is treated as if it is labor. So you can say it's a fictitious commodity or fictitious labor. Then why it's not the reason, when you say it's labor, then it's kind of carried out by an individual with extra effort in a way that can be, as you documented, be quantified and can be evaluated and rewarded. But seeing other people, feeling empathy is a kind of things that we just do. We often do it unconsciously. And we do it not as a individual with a clear boundary, but we do in a very interactive and intersubjective method. And then we simply carry that into work. But whether or not we now can, to expand the concept of labor to capture that, is that a good strategy? Or actually we should move the opposite direction to say, actually, this is something else and it should not be colonialized by the logic of labor. And I think you also mentioned in your book, one telling, is not your own observation, but I think it's a citing from literature, is the service workers, especially relatively low-paid workers, often take a pride of their so-called emotional labor. And that somehow making me think, we do have the impression that the well-paid, high-end emotional labor, like in the consultants or in the service industry, often are more sensitive towards the potential alienation and this kind of faking aspect of emotional labor. They feel it's exploited. But actually, in the service industry, if you go to the street and you see the peddlers and people running small restaurants and etc., they also smile at you. You can see the smile is that authentic or not authentic? It's very hard to tell. But often the smile and the greetings are certainly spontaneous, and it can be very tiring. But I also personally observe, at the end of the day, these, Papa Mama shop owners are quite proud that they are capable of performing this emotional labor as a part of the business, assuming they are self-employed or they're employed, as a part of their work and the business. Even though it's not completely authentic or not, but they are proud. And then why do I mention here? So I'm thinking, okay, where does this sense of dignity, where does this sense of pride come from? It is come from a recognition that during the day, I was doing my work. I was laboring. But there is something staying outside of labor that I'm in control. That is what you call the connective capacity. Because I smile to my customers, I service them, and that is my job. But I create a connection. I have the capacity to perform a smile and make them feel good. And they did go away, having a nice meal and very happily left. So I am doing my job. I'm proud of the capacity, but also I'm very happy that as a result of my work, I did create some genuine, nice sense of happiness and connectivity among my customers. And if the person is completely regarding him or herself as a laborer, if the person thinking, okay, what I do is labor, then the question is that, okay, how can I make sure I'm not exploited? How I can make sure all my effort will be recognized and rewarded? That will be one line of thinking. If the person is kind of thinking, okay, part of me is doing my labor, but I have another one, have a consciousness over the labor consciousness, and recognize there is something of my capacity which stay outside of labor, but nevertheless I deploy it. And then that gives them another sense of dignity and respect. So one strategy is to enlarge that space. I don't know. I mean, this is my, you stimulated me thinking of that way. So the final point is about the machine do the rational thing, human do feeling, is that the kind of doing together model, as you mentioned, what I as an anthropologist think of that. Number one, probably there is a history to that trend, and that history actually, probably you can say from early 20th century, that is parenting. Because in the modern societies, especially in urban societies, parenting is no longer directly tied to livelihood activities. So parenting is more and more become kind of a feeling job. And then the actual education, I mean, how children, and of course now there's no such thing as a child labor in advanced countries, and how the child running around doing housework, how do they do study, and how they look after themselves. That is all becoming a separate, sorry? Yeah, it's this kind of activity, it become a separate domain. And the parent just look after emotion and become a feeling, right? So in a way that is such a trend, I thought it's very interesting, some clue could be gained from there. But then I'm also thinking of there is a partly informed by this history, I am also worried about the trend in human society that there is a feeling itself become almost autonomous and independent domain, removed from material activities and the material rational thinking, because there's no such a thing. We know the feeling, if the feeling is not attached to very concrete material activities, the feeling itself will become very problematic. And I don't have evidence, but based on my observation among the Chinese young people, very often the psychological well-being is damaged if you live in a condition that you receive lots of attention. Actually, you're cared by your parents, almost spoiled. But then that kind of feeling, because detached from the material basis, itself will create a situation that you will be oversensitive, become paranoid. You overread all kind of signs and signals and etc. So that is another whether. So I have some worry about the situation that there's some people do full-time pure feeling, and then already I think the problem of the 21st century is the divorce of the feeling of the human nature away from very concrete material practices. I stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for these really interesting, provocative, thoughtful comments. I have so much to say. I feel like this conversation could go on for a very long time. I think I'll just take them in order, if you don't mind. The first question or the first point was kind of the importance of naming something. Why do we name something? What's the point of that, really? And you kind of distinguish between research that might try to analyze why something's going on versus or kind of the enterprise of naming. I feel like naming is vital, as perhaps you can tell. And as I did mention in the book, when I give talks on this, people come up to me afterward and say, I am a nurse, and thank you for writing this. Thank you for giving a name to this. I'm equipped with something that I can go back and explain to my brother, my husband, my administrator, what I'm trying to do, or what gives value to my work, or what, being able to name something makes something visible that then people can use for their purposes. And I often tell my grad students, kind of to be careful what you name, have what you name be be aware of the repercussions of naming something. And that when we name something, we kind of arm ourselves with the power to drive action. So I will add parenthetically that you mentioned the term emotional labor, and that's another thing that's been given a name by Arlie Hochschild in 1977 was her first time. And people often conflate emotional labor and what I'm trying to do, which is connective labor. And I'm actually I'm fine with the notion that connective labor is a variant of emotional labor. Emotional labor was actually originally coined to mean emotion management, or that kind of ginning up of potentially false feeling for a wage. And so that raises the questions of authenticity that you brought up in your third question, which I will get to in a minute. But in any case, connective labor is actually something very specific. It's this witnessing and reflecting work that's received by the other. And I don't mind if we think of it as a variant of emotional labor, if we define emotional labor as kind of anything involving emotions between people for a wage. But they are different. In terms of, the emotion management is a very specific thing and not the same thing as this witnessing work that I'm talking about. And I thought it was worth naming so that I could give power to the people who do it, and to be able to, kind of make arguments with those, principally with their insurers and their program administrators, and also for our kind of general society, for our awareness about what AI and apps are aiming at. So I really had, my intention was twofold. I thought your second question was very powerful. Why is this labor? What do we lose by calling it labor? Is there something else? Is this not labor? By calling it labor, are we already kind of giving some allegiance to kind of a capitalist view and making it more susceptible to the very kind of trends that I am worried about, its systematization and its automation? And I find that very provocative, and I'm quite sympathetic to the position from which that question arises. I would answer in I think a pragmatic sense, which is the words connective labor do something that is, I think, useful in the conversation, because it highlights both the connection, highlights the interactivity, and also highlights the working conditions of this labor. So it does both of those things. For example, other words that are out there that are kind of related are therapists will call this the therapeutic alliance. Doctors will call this the doctor-patient relationship. Business writers will call this emotional intelligence, or your emotional, they'll say your EQ, in reference to IQ, obviously. Each of those has problems. I'll just take the business writers, for example. By calling this emotional intelligence, what you're not doing, you're locating it entirely within the individual, and you're erasing the deeply collaborative nature of this work, the connection that makes this work. So I have a whole chapter on how this work is uniquely human. And some of those characteristics that I highlight are its collaborative nature. That is, it is people coming together to do this together. It is not located inside the individual. So this emotional intelligence is not actually useful. So hence the word connection. Your focus was on labor. And I agree to some degree that, we could call it, what did you say? Intersubjective action or connective action, perhaps connective practice, something like that. But I wanted to draw people's attention. Again, it's like, what does naming do? And I wanted to draw people's attention to its working conditions. And I fear that while, yes, it happens in for a wage and not for a wage. It is what parents do with children. It is what friends do with friends, or whatever. I wanted to draw attention to how we are treating it in the workplace. Hence the point about making it labor, connective labor. Perhaps we could subsume connective labor under a larger idea of connective practice. I'd be totally open to that. Maybe that'll be book 5. Relatedly, in the kind of same point, you kind of talked about how this is something we just do, was the word you use. It's like we do, and I think you were kind of saying we do this all over, not just in work. And I want to say that that kind of gets at a central tension that animated this work from the beginning. And that is, how do we scale this up? Now that question, that very question, is a question that comes from like Silicon Valley. This is how they talk. How do we scale up good teaching? How do we scale up? But on some level, I share that question. I share the worries about access and availability. And I think a central tension here is how do we both kind of support and enable this, what I favor, this kind of artisanal, emotional craft work, and at the same time make it available for as many as possible, and make that availability not dependent on whether, as I said, you are lucky or affluent. And that tension between the desire for the work to be, powerful, meaningful, and kind of full, and at the same time be available on a broad scale, that tension kind of animated the whole book. Me trying to figure out how do we systematize this connective practice, we might say. So calling it connective labor was one way to kind of point out that this is a skill, even though it is also interactive. It can be trained. And that actually was much of my observation. I actually, on purpose, chose to observe people being trained in this work, because I was particularly interested in how when we train someone in something, we kind of abstract out the common principles, and we point, like, this is what I'm doing, and we take it away from its very particularistic emotional context in between two idiosyncratic people with baggage. We kind of say, well, generally I do no. And I was just very interested in that tension between this artisanal work and its systematization. So yeah, the word connective labor was very much on purpose. Your third question was about kind of authenticity and the kind of, or maybe this was part of point number 2, but it was kind of, you were pointing to how low-income people or laborers actually derive pleasure from when they are providing emotional labor. They derive pleasure, and some of that pleasure might be in the connections that they are making, and that those connections are part of their core humanity. I'm very interested in this idea. I agree that that is a robust research finding, that service workers find pleasure in emotional labor. And that's kind of counter to many kind of initial theoretical hypotheses. That was kind of a surprise finding, like, we thought that this would lead to their greater alienation. And as it turns out, they derive pleasure from it. And I think the idea that the pleasure they're deriving is from the connections that they're making is a really interesting and provocative further hypothesis that I would love to investigate further. I did find that people get a lot of meaning and profound, kind of impact on their own experience, on their own selves from doing this work. And maybe that is what makes service work okay with some forms of emotional labor. So I just thought that was a really interesting point that I want to kind of put a pin on for future reference. Your last point about, like, don't get too happy about the separation between feeling and thinking. Completely agree. I actually teach a class, it's a very large lecture class called The Sociology of Family. And that's a central finding, or a central theme, is that families used to be bound by material concerns and was not actually an emotional center. It was not defined by emotion. It included boarders and apprentices and all kinds of different people in the same unit, and it was an economic unit, and it was about shared economic fates, and people shared jobs and shared material conditions, and it was about the emotions were not the center. And over the last, say, 200, 300 years, as we move away from a kind of agricultural society, you actually see these different functions of a family kind of slough off, and what is remaining is this emotional intensity. And that has led to families being more emotionally satisfying. For some, marriages can last 65, 70 years, and at the same time also much more unstable. So, because emotions can be fleeting. So that very instability is what you highlight in what could happen to the self if we rely entirely on kind of emotions for our well-being. I'm not entirely sure I see that, because the material conditions that are grounded, that ground a self, aren't necessarily captured by kind of technology and the thinking that happens over in kind of the kind of autonomous, rational, say, medical diagnostics or whatever. Like, there's a way to be a thinking self that is not automated. But I hear what you're saying, and the linkages between emotions and feeling and instability are corroborated across many dimensions and domains of human life. And I think that's a really smart observation. Thank you for these comments. I really appreciate them.
Thank you very much for both your wonderful comments and dialogues. You use a little privilege as a moderator. I also have two brief questions, if that is okay. The first question, I totally agree with you that emotion not only is useful to our valued goals, but also define human beings. But part of the definition is that we're allowed to be not emotionally ready to the person we are interacting with. I used to say that it's part of the natural phenomenon, but in your book, I thought we should better call it that's more humane. So think about a case that the doctor said, "I'm in a hurry," to the patient. Perhaps the machine or AI never says, "I'm hurry," or "I can't give you responses," because it seems to be less and less likely to get no response for the powerful algorithm when we are more subject to stronger, powerful analysis of our emotional changes. But think about the real cases of interaction. So how can we allow people to be non-responsive? How can we allow people not ready to give emotional responses to us? That's part of the emotional interactions. So the patients may have the natural inclination to understand, if we say understanding is natural, that to understand that caregiver is not ready to give care in a particular moment. So not to be emotional ready is part of the emotional interaction that define what you say personalization. Exactly like, so if we use the connective labor, so how can we accommodate the moment that we see this connection instead of a deeper connection between us? That for me, it's remarkable boundaries between truly human interaction and interactions underpinned by AI intelligence. Yeah. So what does non-emotional responses mean in the cognitive labor or in the emotion interactions? And the second question, it's actually for both of you. I hope to could get you into another round of conversation. So does connective labor have a spatial preference? Does connective labor has a geographic orbit? And how can we know which part of that geographic orbit is preferred within the emotional interaction? For example, I believe that's Professor Xiang's concern for the past 3 years. Are we connecting to other people and the cost of the proximity and the cost of people and concrete material basis surround us? For example, I have disputes and disagreements from my roommates. I could have brawls and quarrels and very violent encounter with them during the night, and then we'll go get a drink and get drunk and come back and sleep. That settles it. But now I should say no encounter, no conflict at all. I will go post a moment on the social media says, I really had a bad day because of some really bad responses from somebody who just sleep under my bed. So that is the case that I believe is commonly happening for college students today. They are trying to connecting people, but not peripherally connecting to the most surrounding, proximate, or intimate environment. So that's my question. Does connecting labor have a special preference? If so, how can we predict that? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for both of those questions. Really interesting. The first about like kind of when people are not ready to connect and kind of the way I would approach that or answer that is that the kind of imperfection of human connection is part of what feels very human. So actually, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned about people making mistakes, and I kept hearing again and again from therapists who have this articulated. They call it a therapeutic rupture, and there's actually research that shows that when there's a rupture and then there's a repair, the kind of stops and starts of connection actually feel more human than a perfectly seamless seeing by the other. Now, I would say engineers are starting to notice this, and there is actually AI work that I have seen in which they purposely code mistakes into the AI agent that then has been shown through research to make humans feel more kind of gentler and hospitable and kind of kinder to the AI agent. So that's may not be a distinction that we can rely on forever. But the point you were making on about like what happens when the other is not really ready, and the kind of fits and starts of connection right now are part of what makes something feel more human. It actually is a more important part of human connective labor, I would say, than the idea of a perfect encounter. That second one, before I turn it over to Mr. Xiang, Professor Xiang, I would say, yes, there is definitely a spatial component to this. I have a whole chapter on how people do this work, and the first point that I make, because it was what they told me, was how they use their bodies. And I had a wide range of practitioners. Some people were very much like, this is a science, not an art. This is a science, and other people were like, more open to different kinds of inputs. But all across that spectrum, they would be like, there's a vibe, or it's a spidey sense, or they would use they had language for the fact that they are using their emotional antenna in a way that relies on nonverbal signals that require bodily co-presence. Now, there are some people who do this over Zoom, especially during COVID and more, increasingly in the last 5 years. And it's possible, so you miss some of those nonverbal signals, but most of them talked about how vital bodily co-presence was for doing this really well. And so you need to be nearby. I'll use that to defer to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Two quick responses. Number one is that the perfection, this is now objectively, it is a trend. People expect immediate and response, and if the other party is always ready, and we know that is a main source of tremendous pressure created for lots of service workers. And then what Allison mentioned that's very interesting, and the AI deliberately factor in human-like mistakes. I mean, this reminded me, of course, we know in ancient time, which is the most widespread in the Middle East, when you weaving carpet in Iran, Iraq, and always you will deliberately make a mistake in a piece of carpet. And then the belief behind that, if the piece of carpet is too perfect, you will attract the envy of the god, and also you will attract the envy of your neighbors. And then the cultural mechanism behind that is very complex, you would say, and in this kind of the sense of envy actually is a way to keep a society more egalitarian. It's allow, as the moderator asks us, it's allow for imperfection, allow certain space for people to be unready and broke down. And then they say, okay, if you're too perfect, it will be envy. Envy is destructive. So that is a very wise way of organizing society. Nothing should not be always a maximum efficiency, etc. But now we have the AI and all the machine, and nobody now is worried about envy. In social media, everyone wanted other people to envy them. So Trump would be just every day is worried that people not envy him enough. So so society has changed. And what does it mean? And then you probably go back to the Marx analysis of capitalism. If you don't have the kind of small breakdown, if the whole system becomes so rationalized, then yeah, every day become very smooth, convenient, everything is ready. But then we are rushing into a probably dead end, and we are rushing into a kind of we lost the direction. It maybe have a sudden total crisis of collapse. That is quite likely because the self-adaptation mechanism has been lost, like the mistake in the carpet, that kind of thing. And then about the speciality of connection, I mean, it's important for all reasons. And I think Allison's book very powerfully demonstrated that, from this Champlin's how to touch your hand and the hugs, and also a woman, I can't remember her name, she was talking about the energy, the air, you feel tickling on your body, and it goes well, you will be able to read the air. So it is not only about physical speciality per se, but it's really about body, about the way a human, how we sense our own existence and surrounding. And I don't know what people have done any Zoom meeting between dogs, and it's be interesting to know whether no dogs bark at each other over Zoom, because as an organism, as an evolution, after million years in nature, and you do rely on your immediate surrounding in order to establish a sense of self and get all this capacity flourishing. You need that material surrounding. So that's it, of course, important. But I think the speciality worth attention also because this is a weapon or at least a battlefield that ordinary people can use. It is a kind of effective weapon of the weak, of the people, fighting against these large forces, such as AI, large and state power. Because AI and this capitalism in general, state power, they have a special power of eradicating the nearby, because they can create a huge system which can govern millions and millions of people by using a single standard, regardless of where you are, etc. Now, of course, empowered by AI. But if we make ourselves very sticky and make us stubborn, and at least a distance from this very smooth, single, abstract system, that would be a basis of resistance as well as resilience. Thank you.